From RFN Studios, this is Radio Free Norfolk. For our Remembrance Day episode, I had an opportunity to speak with retired veteran and advocate Christian Lillington about his military experience.
My name is Christian Lillington, as you said. I ended up finishing my career after 26 years and a little bit as a lieutenant colonel, wherein I was commanding the base in Meaford. Now, if I back that up the 26 years and go back to the beginning, I left a small town in Cape Breton, Nova Scotia in 1993. I went to RMC for 4 years and then became a commissioned officer in the Royal Canadian Armoured Corps, and then moved around 15 times with the military in my 26 years. My oldest child has moved 9 times, and she's now settling herself into Ottawa. So I've done a number of positions at the various levels, but essentially the highlights of my career would be the training establishment and working within it, training soldiers and officers. My deployments to both Africa and my 2 to Afghanistan, the last one being a combat tour for me as a squadron commander of reconnaissance. And then obviously the last highlight, and that's how I ended my career, which is a nice way to end your career, was as the commanding officer of a base and training center in Meaford, Ontario. So, I've had the ability to be exposed to both the sort of tactical, operational, and strategic levels of the military, which was very fortunate that I was afforded all those opportunities. I was afforded the opportunity to learn a second language and be fluent, all in this sort of duration of that 26-year period. So it has been a very fast-moving machine, and I'm in my mid-40s and I'm retired from one career and looking for another.
We spoke about the inclusive brothers and sisters in arms attitude and the undeniable bond that develops between soldiers who train together, eat together, drink together, fight together, and have each other's backs.
I grew up in the military, in the Army, so I use the term soldier, not airman or woman, not sailor. But I do believe that the term soldier is gender neutral. Even when I was a commanding officer, I felt very confident in saying soldiers first, which is the motto of the base where I worked, and I believe that to sort of apply to everybody. As far as camaraderie goes, I think that one of the things that the military has going for it as a sort of warrior type profession, amongst other warrior professions that are outside of the military, would be like police, emergency services, fire, corrections, Coast Guard, medical professionals, social services. Like, I consider them all to be warrior professions, but within the military, there's no doubt in my mind that the ability to bond a group of strangers, essentially from across Canada, into sort of a tight group of soldiers that can sort of act on intent is very quick. And it happens from the first day they sort of get into the military, when they move off to their basic training in Saint-Jean, Quebec, and as well when they progress through their basic military qualifications and then finally become trained for whatever trade they've signed on to do. So the camaraderie starts from day one, and essentially it just builds as you go through. Essentially at the beginning, it'll become very much based on what trade you're in, but as you get further on, you'll have more pride in your unit, more pride in your corps, in your profession as a whole. And so camaraderie is the core, I would say, one of the core sort of elements of being a soldier. And it's something that keeps people going even in the hardest of times. The demographic of those that get enrolled in the military is actually quite diverse. I would say, however, I think that the diversity generally comes from the reserve element of the Canadian Armed Forces. If they were looking at sort of who joins where and when and why. But you are correct in that there are a lot of people who come from sort of the eastern provinces, the Atlantic provinces, some of the prairie provinces. There's generally a draw on a lot of those people for military professions. But I would say, in my experience, every sort of base I've been posted to, there's always a really good sort of mixture of people from coast to coast. I'll bet you'll always have a lot of East Coast people. It doesn't matter where you're posted.
I asked Christian how he felt working for the government and if he felt Canada has always had good intentions, and also how he felt about Canada's time in Afghanistan.
As far as it goes with respect to the will of the government, I'm a retired officer, and I can sort of speak kind of freely as I wanted. But I would be fair in saying, either whether I was serving or not, that it is no doubt in my mind that the military does serve the government. It does serve the government in its foreign relations, but also its relations at home. They do have a very strict policy as far as Canada Defence is a Canada First defence policy. And I'm sure it's something that has evolved and changed even since my time serving, but it really focuses on everything Canada first, be it domestic operations, protection of like local resources, aid to civil power, whatever it is that the military gets called upon to do. It's definitely Canada minded first. Having said that, Canada is as a heavy hitter worldwide. I'll bet sometimes our contributions may be small in number. They are very, very rich in quality. And so we have Canadians all across the world as we have it now in some smaller elements, but definitely in order to influence governments and NATO and all of these various elements that are important to our ability to function as a country. So I know that there may be people who object to the military, how it's used and when it's used. Even for COVID, there were elements of the military used to help with various nursing homes, et cetera. To my knowledge, it went surprisingly well. People are critical of everything because it's just another target politically. I think it's easy for people to criticize using what they see every day. And I mean, depending on where you live, you may have the military present in your life, whether you're a civilian or not, just because when you live beside a base, you become sort of part of that culture just through the sounds and smells and seeing people in uniform, et cetera. Yes, there is that element of being a resource for the government, but it's definitely not something I think is ever abused. It's definitely something that you could always have an opinion about, our time in Afghanistan, even, various campaigns that we've been part of going way back to, the wars, the World War I and II. But there's always going to be a group of people that criticize and sort of make it a political sort of affair. I reflect very frequently on my time in Afghanistan. I think, having left there and Canadians having sort of pulled out many years ago now, I guess, I wonder about, the effect we had. But certainly at the time I was there, I felt like we were making a difference in not just providing security, but building governance and development to the various elements of the Canadian government that were there. It wasn't just the military. We had elements of foreign affairs, and various other diplomats that were there helping build. Elements of the RCMP would be deployed. And so, people see the military, they see the military moving. It's easy to sort of, when they touch down somewhere, is to know that there's a ship here in this water, et cetera. It's hard to hide anything in today's world, and there's no intent to hide things, but you don't ever see, the diplomats. You don't see all of these people who are there, foreign aid workers, et cetera, people who help when we go to these war-torn countries, or these, for example, the ones where there's earthquakes and we deploy the elements of our disaster response unit. You don't ever see all of the civilian elements that go with them, the civilian policing elements. So no one ever sort of looks at those elements with any sort of critical eye, but they're very critical of the uniforms that move. And I understand that too, because it's taxpayers' money to fuel those jets, to move those vehicles, to move those soldiers, to pay those soldiers, et cetera. So it's not lost on me, but certainly it's part of being one of the greatest nations in this world. I mean, Afghanistan is a very different environment, and I think that it, like we used to say, it takes generations to change. I would say not just one, but several. And we're talking about a country that's been invaded numerous times by numerous different nations. And I'm not saying we were invaders, but like you have to look at a culture that constantly has foreign people in it trying to help them develop and straighten out their issues with respect to, like, development of terrorist cells, et cetera. It's very complex. And so I agree with the comments of the other veteran that you spoke to, in the sense that there were very promising signs, but it doesn't mean that Afghanistan has many borders, and it has very problematic factions on some of those borders that'll always be a country that's in a bit of turmoil, in my opinion.
As a result of his service, Christian has struggled with PTSD. I asked him his opinion on the mental preparation soldiers receive before deployment, and he shared his insight into mental health.
I'm a huge proponent, obviously, of mental health, having suffered myself with some mental health issues because of my deployments, et cetera. And I would say that I'd probably be a little bit more critical of this element in this question, having lived it. Essentially, there's still not a lot of, if I use the term, mental fitness that is practiced in the military, in my experience. Now, there are many efforts being made to implement various elements to help soldiers deal with stress tactical breathing, positive self-talk, various things that they do during training to boost the confidence of soldiers. But that's not enough, in my opinion, just to say that mentally soldiers are prepared to go to, for example, an African country and see, children that have been deceased or, left alone, or, there's things that we see that they go against sort of your moral code or against your sort of moral fiber. And it's not because you were told anything but just sort of be there. And, it's not because you've done anything, but just being in the presence of things that are horrific. How do you mentally prepare everyone for every situation? You can't. So you build resiliency. And I think that the military is going the route of working on mental resiliency, and that would be the mental preparedness that you're talking about. But I still think it's embryonic. I don't think it's necessarily grown, or it's to the point where you could call it effective. Like, for example, the physical fitness in the military has always been sort of a foundation, a pillar, if you will, of, the profession, being fit. It's something we get tested on every year, et cetera, et cetera. But mental fitness is you get screened when you leave for deployment, when you come back from a deployment. And other than that, when you're in country, you could literally go a whole career and not have to see, a mental health professional or even a padre for that matter. And when soldiers do, it was always my strong opinion that if they want to deploy, they would, and they would say what was required to do so. And if they didn't, they could equally do the opposite. So there also is an element of looking at the type of people who are in the military and how they also manage their own mental health as individuals, because there's a certain type of person that joins the military, in my opinion, and rarely is it a type B person. It's generally a person who's a go-getter, seeks challenges, etc. That's been my experience. There's vicarious trauma too. Like you could not be present, but also experience trauma, secondary trauma, etc. I'm a strong believer, like if you look at, for example, the policing profession, like people think of just the police, the frontline police that could experience trauma. But if you look at a 911 dispatcher, for example, who's not on the scene per se, but has to manage the call or various calls, like that's an example of someone who can, in my opinion, occur just as bad a trauma as the person who's on scene. That's just my opinion, because I've actually met people who have had this type of trauma, and they live horrors and stuff that and it's no different. That's one of the things with mental health and both mental health fitness, or mental fitness as I called it earlier, is that it's so hard to sort of regulate. Like it's easy for physically to say, okay, the soldiers have to do so many kilometers in so much time, they have to do so many push-ups, so many sit-ups, whatever the test is. You can see it, you do it or you don't do it. But mentally, you're screening every year, for example, which would be hugely onerous for the medical system, which is already probably overtaxed in the military. You would have to rely on people's will to share what they're thinking, how they're feeling, how they're managing their home life. And those are the kind of things like using the DSM-5, et cetera, all those kind of questionnaires. It really comes down to the professional, the individual soldier having confidence in the system, having confidence in the chain of command, that if they do have mental health issues, that someone will have their back, and they won't be, for example, punished career-wise because they are suffering, or they are just at the point where they're at burnout, for example. And that's the other element of mental health, is that people, I spoke about seeing horrific things. I gave you a couple terrible examples of things that people that I know that have endured, and personally some of the things I've seen. Then there's the element of stress and people being overworked and burnout. And that's also a part of mental health, is that the military is definitely a profession where people can work 24/7, as we say, 365 days a year. And that culture of overworking and being tied to various electronic devices and always needing to answer really is a leadership issue, but it's taxing on everybody, because, people can put in individual policies on, work tempo, et cetera. But it's a voracious sort of environment for like an appetite from the military, but from the government to know things, to be doing staff checks, to be sending people on overseas, to be, making sure vehicles are prepared, et cetera. There's always work to do. It's like there's never like a list of things and where it's done. It's never ending. And that's another aspect of mental health. People just can't keep up with the tempo. And that applies to both domestic and just working everyday normal military routine in Canada, and people who are deployed, where you're expected to work as long as the day is. And sometimes those are 18-hour days. So, you add that sort of element of the staff level because a lot of our deployed elements are staff type elements. They're not soldiers who are on the ground. They're people who are augmenting bigger, larger organizations like the Americans, etc. I think rarely, in my experience, rarely have I been on operations or overseas where I was in a culture that I understood completely. I'll bet you try to embrace the culture of the nation that you're in, but it's very easy for people to lose sight of that and accept things completely, because it's like you said, it's just so different that some people just can't get their minds around it. And it is problematic, in many ways. If you can train as much as you want for, that cultural sensitivity, but if people, depending on their background, how they were raised, their experience with different cultures, etc., they may not react well to that at all. And there's other people who might, it might just go with the flow because it's part of how they grew up. And then there's that whole group that just doesn't know what to think, and they're trying to understand things as they go, right? And I think as Canadians, and this is something I experienced on my combat tours, that we generally are naive as a culture. Like, we are trusting of other people, we are polite, we want to do well, we're helpful, Yeah. And sort of in that thinking, when you go, for example, we were on and I say combat tour because it's very different being on a staff, and then there's being out, as we say, outside the wire, which is a term I used to not appreciate, but now I understand completely. But being, in danger every day, and sort of realizing that and letting that actually sink in, that in itself, that stress of just leaving the gates every day to go do whatever, or to be in camp and be mortared on every second day or every third day, that kind of continuous stress level of danger and risk, some people don't manage that well. And some people manage it well in country, but don't manage it well when they return home. And it's not something that people ever think about doing follow-ups on, because it's like I said, the military is always doing stuff. So it's a fast-moving machine, and some people get just left in the dust. It's unfortunate, but that is sort of reality.
I was curious what level of mental health supports are available for soldiers during deployment.
Oh, it definitely varies depending on the deployment people are on. For example, if they're on a smaller deployment, you may not have all the elements of a medical system in place, and you might be relying on other nations for that support, or not at all. You might just have to wait until you get home. That would be like my first tour when I was with the United Nations. I was with a very small team of 6 Canadians, and we were working with the United Nations as military observers, and I was deployed in a very, very rural area of Eritrea, which is near Ethiopia and Sudan, the borders thereof. That's where I was. So that would have been an example of no support whatsoever until we sort of got home. But in Afghanistan, obviously, it was a full contingency, a task force, plus it's a supporting elements. And therefore, you have integral support from the military chaplains and chaplaincy, to include, sort of the various religions, etc. We call them padres. And then we had this sort of social worker, sort of mental health teams that would deploy with our Role 3 hospitals. And sometimes there would be some elements in the Role 1 hospital, which is more of a tactical sort of element. But so soldiers would have the ability, for example, if soldiers went through, for example, an IED explosion and were sent back, but they suffered minor injuries, there is a good chance they would go through a debrief to make sure that they are sort of fit for duty and could come back and return sort of to the front line and be operational. So yes, there are supports depending on the size of the contingency you deploy with. But again, a lot of that depends on the will of the person you're trying to care for, and whether or not they want to share, whether or not they want to be there or not be there. A lot of it depends on their will. And that's just my opinion, because how do you get in someone's mind? You can't see it like a broken arm if someone has, issues in their mind.
Going on high-risk deployments, the culture shock, losing friends, injuries, and witnessing the things that our military protects us from can put a lot of weight on a person. With the strong sense of camaraderie in the Canadian Forces, survivors' guilt or vicarious trauma can be common. Christian opened up about his personal experience with PTSD, and I am grateful that he was willing to speak about it to me and to all of you listening.
I do suffer from PTSD as a result of my military service, and it has affected all elements of my life. I went through a very terrible divorce. I was very fortunate in finding an actually fantastic individual who now I'm engaged to, and I suffered as well some turbulence with my children, my 4 children, but now I'm sort of becoming a much better father. But there was a period of time where PTSD really had me in a very bad place, and it kind of all culminated at the end of my career. And so for me, I pushed and pushed for about 10 years with PTSD before I finally collapsed. And it was kind of like a burnout situation. Situation being actually that I had a soldier doing training in Meaford who was from my hometown in Cape Breton, which is, very, very small, villages of less than 1,000 people. And he was training, I knew his mother and his father, and my mother worked with his mother, etc. Anyway, he took his life in a very tragic series of events. And that him taking his life at the end of his training after he was fully qualified to move off to Gagetown, New Brunswick, to be part of the 2nd Battalion of the Royal Canadian Regiment. That tragedy was sort of, for me, I could no longer push any longer. I couldn't just push it down. It's like the analogy that a lot of mental health workers use is trying to hold a beach ball underwater. That's what it's like for people with PTSD that sort of neglect the signs that are there, be it the anger, be it the sleeplessness, be it the anxiety, the insomnia, as I mentioned, the lack of appetite, the irritable bowel, you name it. There's all these things that are very PTSD related in your face symptoms, and people can work through that. They can numb with alcohol. They could use marijuana now. There's all kinds of things they could do to try to work through it. But there's a certain point where that ball is going to surface, and that's usually never a very pretty thing. And, it depends on people's various circumstances. For me, it was very ugly. It happened at a very critical time in my life, in my career. I was very fortunate to have very good people supporting me professionally, and elements of my family were very helpful, and some of my closest friends. But I'm very proud of my service. I don't regret a single day, a single exercise, a single posting. There's nothing of my time in the military that I regret. It's always something I recommend to people as a profession, even if it's only for, 3, 4, 5, 6 years, maybe 12 years, depending on what their contract is. Just to serve your country, in my opinion, is an honor. And in what capacity you do that, it doesn't matter. It's irrelevant to me. You could be working the Air Force, the Navy, the Army, Special Forces. You can do it as a civilian. You can do it as a reserve force soldier or member, or as a regular force member, with the Rangers. So many various elements. In my opinion, that's what it comes down to.
As tough as his career was, Christian says he has learned and gained a lot from his experience.
I was fortunate to have a deployment when I was 24 years old. During 9/11, I was actually deployed in a very, very, like I said, a place where our communications were done via satellite. It was in a war-torn, impoverished part of the world, and I was able to have that, learn very early in my life what we have in Canada, what we don't have. Now, fast forward to my first deployment in Afghanistan in the 2006 era, 5 years later almost. Again, in a country very similar to where I was in Eritrea, but for different reasons and different factions, again, war torn, very few schools, you see things that you just can't relate to as a person, as a soldier, as a father, as a son. And then again, to see that up close and personal a few years later in 2010, it absolutely gave me greater understanding of both world politics, of how various nations have functioned, the history, where Canada has been, where it's going. And I'm very supportive of the military, even like now. I mean, they are so active and involved with NATO. It's hard for me not to have empathy for other countries and other cultures, but also it's hard for me not to be proud of those that are carrying on, doing the good stuff, doing the good work for their fellow Canadians, really. And so now I'm on the other side of serving. I can just be proud of those that serve.
We discuss the concept of hero worship on Remembrance Day and other professions who deserve to share the title of hero.
I think that the various generations of soldiers that have been in various conflicts all have aspects of their history that we need to celebrate. This year's Veteran Week, I think, is focused on the end of World War II, or the 75th anniversary of that. But there's also elements of our history that we need to learn from. And I'm talking about the sort of rough patches, and I think some of those are obvious and others may not be. But I don't like to see any era taken away from. To talk about hero worship, I think that is a bit of a cultural aspect that we've sort of maybe adopted from the Americans. And this is not a slight to any American soldier. I absolutely love American soldiers and the American military and serving with them. But they're, in the United States, every soldier gets thanked. They frequently wear uniforms everywhere, including on airlines, public transport, etc. And there is very much a culture of thanking people for their service. That has been adopted in Canada. I would say it started because of Afghanistan. And that sort of hero worship, I think, is, Canada hadn't been involved in sort of a conflict like that in so long. And it was war, and we were losing soldiers, and people were getting injured. It was quite a bit of it was a shock for us. And so I think that's part of why that sort of culture of thanking people for their service was adopted. Now, that sort of hero aspect, I think that is not something that makes me feel very comfortable. I don't think that if you look at what, all of the emergency services in this country do, policing, corrections, you name it, border services, Coast Guard, everyone plays a role. Like I mentioned that earlier, the warrior nations, as I call them, warriors of various professions really come together, and people don't necessarily thank them for their service every day. And so I think it's, like I said, it doesn't make me feel comfortable, because I would like to serve just like people serve various municipalities, provinces, federal employees. They put on uniforms as well. And it's not always about the IA uniform. I would like to think that's something Canadians would start to adopt fully, for example, to start seeing everyone who wears a uniform, like a military uniform, as a hero, because there are a lot of ordinary people who also serve in the military. And that's just, a way of life. Like I said, it's definitely a representative of all of Canadians, those who join. I think we owe so many other professions the same respect that we give the military. And we don't right now. I don't think there is a day where we recognize first responders or those that were lost in the line of duty or have taken their life as a result of their service. My experience with Remembrance Day is that it is definitely a time that it can be solemn for a lot of people who serve. But most people who serve will recognize anniversaries of various things that have happened to them, as well as they may also, recognize every day they serve those that they've lost or those that have gone before them. So it doesn't just come down to one day. I would say that the majority of the soldiers that I've served with see the 11th of November just as much as a celebration as they do as a day of sort of a dark day of sort of always reflecting on the worst things that have happened and those who've died in the line of duty, etc. It's also celebrating their service, their sacrifice, and those that continue to serve and sacrifice, and their families. So I do think it needs to be more balanced in Canada as it applies to that sort of all these professions that serve. I think as well as it applies to 11th of November, and this year with COVID-19, it's going to be very different. I think we need to always recognize the 11th hour and the 11th day. And I think that people not doing that, that's disrespectful, period. But does it need to be a parade? Does it need to be every cenotaph has, hundreds of people? I don't think we can afford to do that for the safety this year of everyone involved. But just reflecting on it, reflecting on that day, having it sort of recognized nationally in the news, I think that kind of stuff is always going to be important. But it again comes down to how soldiers they generally manage their service every day they serve, not just on one day.
I asked Christian to describe the feeling he gets when he sees people wearing their poppies in November.
I feel proud. I love the poppy tradition. I love that various nations have adopted various traditions on how the poppy looks and the material it's made of, etc. I'm a huge fan of the poppy. I'm a huge fan of Flanders Fields. It is one of those things that makes me happy. And I'm also a very huge fan of fall, like the sort of pre-winter phase of where we live in Canada. And so for me, it also denotes sort of that pre-Christmas sort of season of school for the children and work when I used to work, I guess, being in a sort of quasi-retirement right now. But it makes me proud. It makes me proud to know that almost every Canadian I see is wearing one. Rarely does someone not have one, and usually it's because they've dropped it or whatnot. The Royal Canadian Legion does very well with their Poppy Fund, and that also, they're being supported. And I know that the Legion does a lot to support soldiers in everything they do.
There are certain assumptions or stereotypes people think of when it comes to veterans. Christian shared his thoughts.
For Canadians, when they see someone in uniform, and let's focus on the military. I don't think that anyone can assume when they see a soldier that soldier, for example, has experience or has experienced war or trauma, etc. At the same time, they can't take for granted if that individual has or has not had that experience. Respect the fact that your nation does have a military and that it uses it for good and not bad. And that's a very simple message, but it's very rarely can anyone say that we've gone somewhere for the wrong reasons. I don't think so, because when you go and you see people in need, we can use really simple examples like a country that's just been, with an earthquake or a hurricane. That's easy. People see that, oh, you're going to help them. That's easy. You're giving them water and blankets and building shelters. More contentious deployments come up, like Afghanistan, like Iraq, etc. And people are very critical of that. Well, it's really not any different than how we're being used for other sort of effects in the world. So I think that when Canadians look at veterans, they have to appreciate that serving members get called on to deploy, on that moment's notice. If they're fully trained and ready to go, they will deploy. The burden of service is not just on the individual, but also on the family. When I look at Canadians and I speak to Canadians, even now being retired, I like to reiterate that you see the deploying members and you can be proud of them and you can be sad for them when they, if they don't come back home alive because they, serving their country, whether in an accident or through combat, their lives are taken. But then very rarely do people remember that the effect on the families, not just the serving members, but also those whose lives are taken. And so I think that level of respect for families, not just the families like the wife and the children that are home, but the immediate and sort of the broader family, people back home, as people like to refer to them, because people in the military also get moved. Rarely do they ever live where they've joined. It's just not the way it works.
For anyone considering joining the military, having had a long career, Christian gave his advice.
I would like nothing more than for people to get what they want when they join. So I always tell people, if there's something you really want to do, you should really try for that and hold out until you get what you want. The recruiting process is very strategic in how it does its intake plan. If someone wants to be a medic, but when they go to the recruiting center, they're told, no, the only thing that's open is sort of infantry, whatever, bosun. There's various trades that are open, but not the one you want. I always tell them, just wait, because a lot of people will join the military in a profession expecting to move to another profession, and that's not an easy process. So that's the first piece of advice. It might be trivial, but for me, it's important because a lot of people join with great intention and they don't get what they want, and that makes them unhappy when they serve. And they're, like I said, not everyone you see is necessarily a happy soldier or a professional soldier because they're not doing what they hope they would do when they joined. Other piece of advice, I would say that expect that it will be stressful for both them and their family, whether they're married, they have a partner or children, what have you. It will be stressful for everyone involved, not just the member, him or herself. Like, it will be stressful for the person, the individual, absolutely. But everyone else gets affected, whether you're at home or you're not at home, you're on a career course, you're not, you're just not present because you're working all the time. That kind of stuff takes a toll. So that is also sort of a warning I would give people. Then there's also all the positive aspects I would tell people, like serving is absolutely thrilling. It is something like, whether I was serving Canada on exercise during operations or overseas on exercise or operations, I have had so much experience, be it in the north of Canada, be it overseas in the Ukraine, in Africa, Afghanistan. I've been in so many different places because of the military and I'm able to see things. It's very exciting. Doesn't matter what trade you pick, that when you serve, you're going to do things that are going to broaden your knowledge of your own country, but also other countries worldwide. It's exciting to know that when you join and once you're trained, all these doors open. And yes, there's that whole element of being in the right time, right place in the military, because not everyone can deploy all the time. But because there's so many deployments now, it's so frequent that people are just moving all the time overseas and coming back and getting ready to go again. So I would also reiterate all of those very positive aspects. So I give them a lot of warnings about sort of what they can expect for work tempo, and then I give them all of those very positive aspects, the things that I was able to do. And Like I said, I was able to learn another language. I was able to, get a master's and sort of broaden my education. Those things were all afforded to me by the military. That's not something I just went on my own and did. It was done in the line of my duty.
Christian also had some advice for those who may become a military spouse.
So those who are going to become military spouses wherein they're not going to themselves serve, but support someone who is serving, I think the first thing I would say is expect to be very patient, because it's definitely not something that's an easy lifestyle. You've become very much nomadic in your ways of living, moving around, always transitioning children through various schooling systems. So that's very stressful. So I would say be patient with that, expect that level of stress. The other thing too is very, very pragmatic, but also to look at professions that you can be mobile with, becoming, for example, moving into professions in the medical field that transition well province to province, because there's a lot of professions that don't transition well within Canada. And so being very practical about how you pick that, whether you decide to stay at home and support your children, you're able to manage that in a career. 2 careers in one household can be also very difficult. So also expect that clash. At a certain point, maybe the military member needs to make a decision on whether they're going to sort of slow down their progress in order to support their spouse. I think, in a nutshell, I would just say expect to go through some hard times, but also expect a lot of really fun and great experiences. Like military members get paid very well. They have great benefits. They, when they move, very rarely they pay for things involved in their move. So it's also exciting to be moved around Canada. There's an element of that excitement that I think it does apply to every family, but there's also a little of the anxiety that comes with moving and all of the work that goes with that. I would just recommend that families prepare that it's going to be a little bit of work for everybody. It's not just the person who serves, who wears the uniform, who feels the stress. Everyone feels that stress.
For many people in careers like Christian's, the trauma may not hit right away. Often, it is in the slow pace of retirement that it catches up to people, or they may just struggle with the change.
Well, in retirement, I continue to be an advocate for mental health within the military, but also for that sort of warrior nation that I spoke of. I've created a website called warriorsforlife.ca, and essentially I'm trying to find a role for myself in that sort of retirement community to help veterans, knowing that there's already a lot of people out there to do it. And so that was the only other thing I was going to mention, that I know there's a lot of people who do retire who continue to help and serve and assist veterans as they retire, or people as they're serving and retire. It's a very difficult transition, and a lot of people, that's lost on a lot of civilians in Canada, in the sense that they assume that when you serve, you leave, and you retire on the sunset. You have this great retirement, a cottage in the woods, and it's not always the way it works. A lot of people will go from working very intense lives in the military for 10, 20, 30, 35 years, and when they do retire, they don't know what to do with themselves. Some of them literally die, and others develop mental health issues because it's finally all culminated. It's all come to fruition, this intense life they've lived. When they get out, it hits them like a train. And that's where a lot of the PTSD develops. It develops when they retire. And a lot of people may see that as being a little nefarious, but it's not. It's just so obvious that when people slow down, they have more time to think. Mm-hmm. And when they have time to think, they understand that the things that they've done and seen may not be in line with, for example, how they were raised. So, there's a lot of things that I would talk to, moral injury. I would speak to sanctuary trauma and various things that are very prominent now in mental health, and PTSD especially. But that very simple transition for the average person in the military is difficult, let alone someone who's being retired medically for a mental health or a complex injury. I've been on many veteran programs for mental health, and it's no doubt in my mind that the ones that are just straight veterans, usually they're organized by gender. That's got to do more with sort of the injuries that have occurred, et cetera, and the level of comfort of people to share with various psychologists, et cetera. But I've been on many of these where the pure element of these programs is the driving factor in people's recovery. And even now, I'm part of a peer group for PTSD, and it is by far one of the more successful elements, tools that I have available to me to sort of manage my illness.
It's important that veterans support each other. There's something very special about that bond. In my research, I found that military psychologists are encouraged to serve deployments so that they can better relate to the people they intend to help. I asked Christian his thoughts.
Yeah, I think any profession getting a deployment, whether they're a psychologist, whether they're a support worker, whether they're a frontline soldier, sailor, airwoman, airman, it doesn't matter. I think having deployments and having experience gives you credibility. And credibility goes a long way, especially when you're having to help people who are senior members that have a lot of experience. They may be more reluctant to open up to someone who has less experience militarily. But then there's that whole balance as well, though, that you also appreciate the professional experience, the professional knowledge of some of these professions. And sometimes that's just enough to supersede any sort of deployment requirements. Like if you're there and you want help and the psychologist is a good psychologist, it really doesn't matter if they've been on numerous deployments, in my opinion. For some of the younger soldiers, it may be important to them because they may not feel like they can relate. But then it comes down to sort of what I call tour shaming. And then people say, well, you're on a tour, but what did you do on the tour? And then I used the term outside the wire earlier. Mm-hmm. That is another sort of part of people not sort of seeing experiences being the same. So yes, there's an element of credibility, but there's also that professional knowledge that goes with some of the professions. The most important thing with that very specific element of the military, the interaction between a soldier and a psychologist or a mental health worker, I think the most important thing is how that bond is developed. So that interaction, I used to say people be very picky in who you pick as a therapist. You interview them, they don't interview you. And I think that's very important. Now, that is not always possible in the military, where you have so many people and you have sort of that sausage machine, as we say. You're trying to push people through all the time for deployments and getting them ready for deployments so they can, what we call DAG green, or be departure ready green, whatever, which means they can leave. All those things lead to things not being always sincere. You might have an interview. Are you okay? Do you have any problems at home? Et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. That is not therapy. That is a checklist. How are you? It's a morale check. People who are looking for hardcore therapy, they have to be very picky in who they pick. And I think that in the military, there's definitely scope for that to happen. I mean, they won't let you go forever and say, I don't like this person, I don't like this person, I like this person. Generally, you'll find a fit within a couple people, but I do think it's still a very important aspect of people's recovery. Like, you're not going to go to a specialist to get an operation on your knee if you're not sure they're the best person for the job, when there's maybe two other people that might be better for it for the same cost. And I use that same analogy for people's mental health.
Being part of the military makes you a part of something much larger than yourself. I asked Christian if he has felt like he's lost his sense of identity being retired, and what it's like getting to know himself simply as Christian Lillington.
No, I'm very happy to be retired, and I'm very happy to not be a sir or, be called by my rank or whatever. I like to call people who are older than me sir or ma'am, depending on who they are. No, it'll always be a major chapter in my life, probably the biggest chapter. It's the first half of my life, but I hope to live as many years again that I've lived to date and to do something different. And like I said, that may be helping other people, other veterans. It may be helping other people within that warrior nation who also need support for mental health. But it's going to be something where I feel like I can give back. And part of that is having served and knowing how much support I had from my fellow Canadians when I served, and knowing that now it's my job to help support those that are doing what I used to do. So I think there's an aspect of changing your identity, which is a pretty complex question for me to answer. It does happen naturally. It takes time to let go. It takes time to let go of the people that you were with, to stay involved in who was moving where and who was doing what. It's really hard to let go of all those aspects, the camaraderie, as you mentioned. But those who are your friends, or truly your friends, will stay in touch with you. And those who are truly involved in your life and that care about your health and your family will also stay in touch with you. And that's always something that I'm very proud of, having served, is that the network of people I've met and who to this day I call part of my inner circle, it would never have been made possible. Even meeting my fiance now would not have been made possible had I not served in the military. And so for me, it's very important to recognize it as a very important part of who I am, but not the only thing that makes Christian Lillington.
Thank you so much, Christian, for sharing your story and for your service. If you or someone you love could use support from other vets, visit www.warriorsforlife.ca.